Hello, guys, welcome to Psych Minds. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share. We are reading Damien by Hermann Hesse. Chapter 3. The Thief on the Cross. I could describe the scenes of my childhood spent in peaceful security at the side of father and mother, relate how I passed this period of my life, playing contentedly in the midst of surroundings brightened by love and tenderness. But others have done that. I'm only interested in this step I took in life in order to attain self realization. All the pretty resting places, happy isles, and children's paradises, whose charm is not unknown to me, I leave lying behind me in the shimmer of a distant horizon, and I have no desire to set foot here again. For that reason, I will speak so far as I intend to dwell on the period of my childhood only of new events which overtook me, of what impelled me forward, enabling me to throw off my shackles. These impulses always came from the other world. They always brought fear, coercion, and a bad conscience in their train. They were always of a revolutionary tendency and a danger to the peace in which I would willingly have been allowed to remain. There came the years in which I had to discover anew that there are within me an instinct which had to lie close and concealed in the bright world of moral sanctions. As to every man, the slowly awakening sense of sex came to me as an enemy and a destroyer, as something forbidden, as a seduction and sin. What my curiosity sought to know, what caused me dreams, desire, and fear, the great secret of puberty that was not at all in keeping with the guarded happiness of my peaceful childhood. I did as everyone else. I led the double life of a child, who is yet a child no longer. My conscious self lived under the conditions sanctioned at home. It denied the existence of the new world whose dawn glimmered before me. But I lived as well in dreams, impelled by desires of a secret nature, upon which my conscious self anxiously attempted to build a new fabric, as the world of my childhood fell in ruins about me. Like almost all parents, my own did nothing to help the awakening life instincts, about which not a syllable was uttered. The only aided with untiring care my hopeless attempts to deny the reality they only aided with untiring care my hopeless attempts to deny the reality and to continue my existence in a childlike world which was ever becoming more unreal and more mendacious. I do not know whether parents can do much in such a case, and I make mine no reproach. It was my own affair to settle my difficulties and find my way, and I carried through the business badly, like most of those who are well brought up. Every man passes through this difficulty. For the average person, this is the point in his life where the demands of his own life come most in conflict with his surroundings, where the road forward has to be attained through the bitterest fighting. For many people, this is the only time in their lives that they experience the sequence of death and rebirth that is our fate. When they become conscious of the slow process of the decay and breaking up of the world of their childhood, when everything beloved to us leave us, beloved of us leaves us, and we suddenly feel the loneliness and deadly cold of the universe around us. And for very many, this pitfall is fatal. They cling their whole life long painfully to the irrevocable past, to the dream of a long paradise, the worst and most deadly of all dreams. But to return to the story, the sensation and dream pictures in which the closes of childhood presented itself to me are not important enough to be described. The important point was that I was once again conscious of the existence of the dark world and the other world. What Frank Cromer had once been to me was now present within myself, and so, from the outside as well, the other world once more gained power over me. Several years had passed since my affair with Cromer. That dramatic and guilty time of my life lay far behind me at that time and seemed to have passed like a quick nightmare into nothingness. Frank Cromer had long since disappeared from my life. I scarcely gave it a moment's thought if I chanced to meet him. But the other important figure in my tragedy, Max Demian, never entirely disappeared from my life. However, for a long time he stood on the far horizon, visible but not affecting me. Only by degrees he approached me again, and I came once more under the ray of his power and influence. I will try to recollect what I know of Demian in that period. Perhaps for a year or longer, I did not have a single conversation with him. I avoided him, and he in no wise forced himself on me. Once or twice when we met, he nodded to me in friendly greeting. Then it seemed to me at times that there was a note of scorn or ironical reproach in his friendliness. But that might only have been imagination on my part. My relation with him and the strange influence he had exercised over me were as if forgotten by him as well as by me. I try to recall his face as I recollect him. I see that I was conscious of his existence after all and took notice of him. I can see him going to school alone or with some of the other big boys. I see him walking among them like a stranger, lonely and still like a celestial body, enveloped in a different atmosphere and subject to his own laws. No one liked him. He was intimate with no one except his mother, and his relation with her did not seem like those of a child but those of a grown up person. The masters left him as much as possible in peace. He was a good pupil, but he did not go out of his way to please them. From time to time we heard in gossip of a word, comment or a retort he had made to a master, and which left nothing to be desired in the way of blunt challenge or irony. I call him to mind as I close my eyes and I see his picture emerge. Where was it? Ah, now I have it again. It was in the street in front of our house. There one day I saw him standing, a notebook in his hand. I saw that he was drawing. He was drawing the old crest with the bird over the door of our house. And I saw stood at the window concealed behind a curtain and gazed at him. I saw with astonishment his attentive, cool, bright features turned to the crest, the features of a man, of a research worker or an artist, superior and full of willpower, oddly bright and cool, with knowing eyes. And again I can see him. It was a little later in the street. We had come out of school and were all standing round a horse that had fallen down. It lay still harnessed to the shaft in front of a peasant's cart and sniffed the air pitifully with open nostrils, while blood flowed from an invisible wound so that the white dust in the street darkened as it became slowly saturated. As I, with a feeling of nausea, turned my gaze away, I saw Damien's face. He had not pressed forward, he stood furthest back of all, rather elegant, quite at his ease as was proper to him. His gaze seemed to be direct at the horse's head, and expressed again that deep, quiet, almost fanatical and yet calm attentiveness. I could not resist watching him some considerable time, and I remember feeling, though quite unconsciously, that there was something very peculiar about him. I saw Demian's face. I saw not only that he had not the face of a boy, but that of a man. I saw still more. I thought I saw or felt that it was not the face of a man either, but something else besides. There seemed to be also something of the woman in his features, and particularly it seemed to me for a moment not manly or boyish, nor old or young, but somehow or other 1,000 years old, not to be measured by time, bearing the stamp of other epochs. Animals could look like that, or trees or stones. I did not realize that precisely. I did not experience the exact sensation which I, a grown up person, am now describing, but what I felt then approximated in some ways to what I have just related. Perhaps he was beautiful, perhaps he pleased me, perhaps even he was repugnant. I could not then determine. I saw only that he was different from us. He was like an animal, or a spirit, or a picture. I know not what he was like, but he was different, inconceivably different from us all. My reminiscence tells me nothing more, and perhaps even what has been described has arisen in part from later impressions. Until I was several years older, I did not come into close contact with him again. Contrary to custom, Damien had not been confirmed with the boys of his year, and in consequence, fresh rumors concerning him were set afloat. In school, they were again saying that he was really a Jew or no, a heathen, and others pretended to know that he and his mother professed no religion or that they belonged to a bad sect in mythology. In connection with his eye, I seem to remember that he was suspected of living with his mother as with a mistress. Presumably, the facts were that he had been, up to that time, brought up without any denominational creed, and that it was now thought that this might be disadvantageous for his future career. In any case, his mother now decided, after all, to allow him to be prepared for confirmation. 2 years later, then, the boys of his own age, hence it came about that for months he was my classmate in the confirmation class. For a time, I kept out of his way. I did not want to have anything to do with him. Too many mysterious rumors had become attached to his name. But above all things, I was worried by a sense of obligation, implanted in me since my affair with Cromer, and just at that time I had enough to do with my own secrets, for the confirmation class coincided with the period when I was definitively enlightened on the matters of sex. And in spite of my goodwill, my interest in the pious instructions was on that account greatly diminished. The things of which the clergyman spoke lay far from me in a still, sacred unreality. They may have been quite beautiful and valuable, but in no way real and stirring, as were in the highest degree these other things. The more indifferent I became, under these conditions, to our spiritual instructions, the more was my interest drawn towards Maximian again. Something or other seemed to unite us. As nearly as I remember, it began in class early one morning while the light was still burning in the schoolroom. The clergyman taking the confirmation class happened to be talking about Cain and Abel. I hardly paid my attention. I was sleepy and scarcely listened. Then, with raised voice, the clergyman began to speak fervently of Cain's sign. At this moment, I felt a sort of contact or exhortation, and looking up, I saw Damien's face turned towards me from a row of desks in front, with a bright speaking look which could have expressed scorn as much as seriousness. He looked at me for a moment only, and suddenly I was listening intently to the clergyman's words. I heard him speak of Cain and the mark on his forehead, and suddenly I felt deep within me the knowledge that the story could have a different signification, that it could be looked at from another view, that it was possible to be critical. From that instant, the bond of communication between Damien and myself was again established, and oddly enough, scarcely had this sense of a certain solidarity between us presented itself to my mind than I saw it transferred as if by magic from the ideal world to the world of space. I did not know whether he had been able to arrange it himself or whether it was pure chance. At that time, I believed firmly in chance, but a few days after, I noticed Damien had suddenly changed his place and was now sitting directly in front of me. I recollect still how pleasant it was in the midst of the miserable workhouse atmosphere of the overcrowded schoolroom to sense the delicate fresh aroma of soap from his neck in the morning. A few days later, he had changed again and now sat next to me, and there he stayed, occupying the same place through the whole of that winter and spring. Morning lessons had quite changed. They were no longer sleepy and boring. I looked forward to them. Sometimes we both listened to the clergyman with the greatest attention. A glance from my neighbor would suffice, calling my attention to a strange story of a peculiar text, and another glance from him, a very decided one, acted on me as an admonition, arousing criticism and doubt. But very often we were bad pupils and heard nothing of the lesson. Damien was always courteous towards masters and schoolfellows. I never saw him commit a schoolboy prank, never heard him laugh out loud or talk in class. He never drew on himself the master's blame, but noiselessly, rather by signs and glances than by whispered words, he knew how to let me share in his own occupations. These were, in part, of a peculiar nature. For instance, he told me which of the fellows interested him and in what manner he studied them. He judged many of them with accuracy. He used to say to me before the lesson, "When I signal to you with my thumb, so and so will look around at us, or will scratch his neck, etc." Then during the lesson, when I scarcely gave a thought to what he had told me, Max would attract my attention by suddenly bending his thumb. I would look up quickly at the boy already designated, and every time, as if attached to a wire, the fellow would make the gesture required of him. I bothered Max to try this on the master, but he did not want to do it. But once, when I came into class and told him I had not done my preparation and that I hoped the clergyman would not question me that day, he helped me. The master looked round for a boy to recite a portion of the catechism, and his roving eye rested on me. He approached me slowly, stretched out his finger in my direction, and already had my name on his lips when suddenly he became absent minded or uneasy, put his hand to his collar, stepped up to Demian, who looked fixedly into his face. He seemed to want to ask him something, but he turned away, to our surprise, coughed a little, and put his question to another boy. These jokes amused me very much, but only gradually did I notice that my friend frequently played the same game with me. It would happen that on my way home from school, I had suddenly the feeling Damian was a little way behind me, and when I turned around, there he was, sure enough. Can you really make another person think what you want him to? I asked him. He gave me information on the subject readily enough and quietly and pertinently in his own grown up manner. No, he said, that can't be done. That is to say, one hasn't a free will. Even if the person acts that way, neither can the other person think as he will, nor can I make him think what I want him to. But you can observe someone well, and then you can say fairly exactly what he thinks or feels. In this way, you can generally predict what he will do the moment after. It's quite simple, but people merely do not know it. Naturally, it requires practice. To take an example from the butterfly world, there is a certain species of moth of which the female is much rarer than the male. The moths reproduce like other animals. The male impregnates the female, who then lay the eggs. Suppose you have in your possession a female of this type of moth. Naturalists have often made the experiment. Then the male moths fly in the night to this female. They even make a flight of several hours' duration. Think of it. For many miles around all the males are conscious of the whereabouts of the only female moth in the district. People have tried to explain that, but it is not easy. Moths must have a sense of smell or something like it, which allows them to pick up and follow an almost imperceptible scent, like a good hound. You understand? There are such things, nature is full of them, and no one can explain them. Now, I draw the conclusion that if among this class of moth the females were as abundant as the males, then these latters would not have such a refined sense of smell. They have it simply because they have been trained like that. If an animal or a man concentrates his whole attention and his whole willpower on a certain thing, that then he attains it. That's all. And it's just the same with what you have asked me. Observe a man sufficiently well, and you will know more about him than he does himself. It lay on the tip of my tongue to mention the word mind reading, and so to remind him of the scene with Cromer, now relegated to such a distant past. But the odd thing between us both was that neither he nor I ever made the slightest reference to the fact that several years ago he had intervened so decisively in my life. It was as if formerly there had been nothing between us, or as if each of us reckoned that the other had forgotten the affair. It even happened once or twice when we were together that we met Frank Cromer in the street, but we exchanged no look, neither did we speak of him. But what has that got to do with willpower? I asked. You said there was no such thing as free will, and there you said one only had to concentrate one's will on something to be able to attain one's end. That doesn't agree. If I am not master of my will, then I can't direct it here or there as I wish. A good question, he said, laughing. You should always ask questions. You must always doubt. But the explanation is very simple. If a moth, for instance, wants to concentrate his willpower on a star or something like that, he can't do it. Only he doesn't try. He seeks only what has sense and value for him, satisfies his need. He gets what he absolutely must have, and it is just there that the unbelievable succeeds. He develops a marvelous sixth sense that no other animal besides him has. People in our position have more elbow room, certainly, and more interest than an animal, but even we are confined to a comparatively small space beyond which we cannot go. To be sure, I can imagine this or that, or make myself believe that I absolutely want to get to the North Pole or somewhere. But I can only carry that out and wish it strongly enough when the desire lies right in myself, when my whole being is really filled with it. As soon as that is the case, as soon as you try to carry out an inward command, then you succeed. Then you can harness your will as you would a good nag. If, for instance, I resolve that our good Mr. Parson shall not wear his spectacles for the future, then that wouldn't work. That is merely play. But when last autumn I had the fixed intention of getting myself moved to another desk, I succeeded. Someone suddenly arrived who came before me in the alphabet and who up to then had been ill because someone had to make room for him. It was naturally I who did it because my willing it had made me ready to seize the opportunity. Yes, I said. That seemed to me a very strange thing at that time. From the moment we began to get interested in one another, you managed to get nearer and nearer to me. But how was that? You did not immediately take a place next to me. For a few lessons at first, you were sitting in rows of desks in front of me, weren't you? How did that come about? It was like this. I wasn't quite certain where I wanted to go when I wished to move from my first place. I only knew that I wanted to sit further back. It was my wish to move towards you, but I was not conscious of this at that time. Simultaneously, your own will was working with mine and helped me. It was only when I sat in front of you that I realized my wish was only half fulfilled. I noticed that really I had desired nothing else than to sit next to you. But on that occasion, no newcomer arrived. No, but then I simply did what I wished and sat next to you without hesitation. The boy with whom I changed places was simply surprised and let me do it without further say. And the parson indeed noticed once that a change had taken place. In fact, whenever he looks at me, something worries him secretly. That is to say, he knows my name is Demian and that something must be wrong that I, whose initial is D, am sitting back there among the S's. But that does not penetrate his consciousness because my will is against it, because I prevent him again and again from becoming conscious of it. He notices now and then that something is wrong. He looks at me and begins to study the question, the good fellow, but I have a simple means at my disposal. I look at him very, very fixedly in the eyes. Hardly anyone can bear that. They always get restive. If you want to get something out of a person and you fix him unexpectedly with your eyes, and if he doesn't get restive, then give it up. You won't get anything out of him ever. But that said, happens seldom. I know only one single person with whom this trick won't help me. Who is that? I asked quickly. He looked at me with eyes somewhat closed, as his fashion was when he meditated. Then he looked away and gave no answer. And in spite of my lively curiosity, I could not bring myself to repeat the question. But I believe he was referring to his mother. He seemed to live on very intimate terms with her, but he never spoke about her, never invited me to his house. I scarcely knew what his mother looked like. Several times I attempted to imitate his example by concentrating my willpower on something so firmly that I would have to attain it. I had desires which seemed to me sufficiently pressing, but nothing came of it. I could not bring myself to talk matters over with Demian. I should not have been able to make him understand what I wanted. He did not ask either. My faith in matters of religion had meanwhile suffered many a breach. Yet, in my manner of thinking, which was entirely under the influence of Damian, I was to be distinguished from those of my schoolfellows who professed an entire disbelief. There were a few such who let occasional phrases to be overheard to the effect that it was laughable and unworthy of man's dignity to believe in a God, and that stories such as those of the Trinity and the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary were simply a joke. It was disgraceful, they said, that such rubbish was peddled about today. This was by no means my way of thinking. Even where I had doubts, the whole experience of my childhood taught me to believe in the efficacy of a godly life such as that led by my parents, which I knew to be neither contemptible nor hypocritical. On the contrary, now as before, I had the greatest reverence for the spirit of religion. Only Demian had accustomed me to consider and explain these stories and articles of belief from a more liberal and more personal point of view, a point of view in which fantasy and imagination had their share. At least, I always took great pleasure and enjoyment in the interpretation he suggested to me. To be sure, much seemed to me too crude, such as the affair of Cain, and once, during the preparation for confirmation, I was terrified by a conception, which, if that were possible, seemed to me even still more daring. The Master had been speaking of Golgotha. The biblical account of the passion and death of Christ had, from my earliest years, made a deep impression on me. As a little boy on such days as Good Friday, after my father had read out to us the story of the Passion, I had lived in imagination and with much emotion in Gethsemane and on Golgotha, in that world so poignantly beautiful, pale, and ghost like, and yet so terribly alive. And when I listened to the Passion according to St. Matthew's by Bach, I felt the mystical thrill of this dark, powerful, mysterious world of passion and suffering. I find in this music, even today, in the Actus Tragicus, a sense of all poetry and of all artistic expression. At the conclusion of the lesson, Demian said to me contemplatively, "There's something in this Sinclair which I don't like. Read through the story, consider it. There's something there which sounds insipid. I mean, this business of the two thieves, it's sublime, the three crosses standing side by side on the hill. But what about this sentimental story of the honest thief, which reads more like a tract? First, he was criminal who had perpetrated crimes and God knows what, and now he breaks out in tears and is consumed by feelings of contrition and repentance. I ask, what's the sense of such a repentance 2 steps from the grave? It's nothing but a real parson story, mawkish and mendacious, larded with emotion and having a most edifying background. If today you had to choose one of the two thieves as your friend, or if you consider which of the two you would the sooner have trusted, it would most certainly not be this weeping convert. No, it's the other who's a real fellow with a plenty of character. He doesn't care a straw about conversion, which in his case can mean simply nothing more than pretty speeches. He goes his way bravely to the end without being such a coward as to renounce the devil in the last moment, who up to that point had to help him. He's a character, and in biblical history, people of character always come off second best. Perhaps he's a descendant of Cain. Don't you think so? I was dismayed. I had believed myself to be quite familiar with the story of the crucifixion, and now I saw for the first time what little personal judgment I had brought to bear on it. With what little force of imagination and fantasy I had listened to it and read it. Demian's new ideas, therefore, were quite annoying, threatening to overthrow conceptions, the stability of which I had believed it was necessary to maintain. No one could no one could not deal with anything and everything like that, certainly not with the all holiest. As always, he noticed my opposition immediately, even before I had spoken a word. "I know," said he, in a tone of resignation. "It's the old story. Everything is all right until you are serious about it. But I'll tell you something. This is one of the points where one can clearly see the shortcomings of this religion. The fact is that this God of the old and the new dispensation may be an excellent conception, but he is not what he really ought to be. He is everything that is good, noble, fatherly, beautiful, sublime, and sentimental, certainly, but the world consists of other things which are simply ascribed to the devil. All this part of the world, a good half, is suppressed and hushed up, just the same as they praise God as the father of all life, but pass over the whole sex life, on which all life depends, and declare it to be sinful, and the work of the devil. I have nothing to say against honoring this God Jehovah, nothing at all. But I think we should reverence everything and look upon the whole world as sacred, not merely this artificially separated official half of it. We ought then to worship the devil as well as God. I shouldn't find that quite right. Or we ought to create a God who would embody the devil as well, and before whom we should not have to close our eyes when the most natural things in the world take place. Contrary to his custom, he had become almost vehement, but he smiled again immediately and pressed me no further. But in me, these words encountered the riddle of my whole boyhood, which I had hourly carried with me, but of which I had never spoken to anyone. What Damian had said about God and the devil, about the official godly world and the suppressed devil's world, that was exactly my own idea, my own myth. The idea of the two worlds or two halves of the world, the light and the dark. The realization that my problem was a problem of humanity as a whole, of life and thought in general, suddenly dawned on me, and this recognition inspired me with fear and awe as I suddenly felt to what an extent my own innermost personal life and thought were part of the eternal stream of great ideas. The realization was not joyful, although it confirmed my mode of thought and made me happy to a certain extent. It was hard and tasted raw, because a hint of responsibility lay therein, telling me to put away childish things and to stand alone. I told my friends the first time in my life I had revealed so deep a secret of my conception of the two worlds, a conception which had been formed since the earliest years of my childhood. He at once saw that I was in thorough agreement with him, but he was not the kind to make the most of this. He listened with greater attention than he had ever given me and looked me in the eyes until I had to turn away. I again noticed in his look this odd animal like timelessness, this inconceivably old age. We will talk more about that another time, he said considerately. I see that you think more than you can express, but if that is so, then you also know that you have never lived in experience all that you have thought, and that is not good. Only the thought that will we live through in experience has any value. You knew that your world of sanction was simply one half of the world, and yet you try to suppress the other half in you, as do the parsons and teachers. You will not succeed. No one succeeds who has once began to think. This impressed me deeply. But I almost shouted, there are horrible things which are really and actually forbidden. You can't deny the fact. And they are forbidden once for all, and so we must renounce them. I know, of course, that there are such things as murder and all possible kind of vice. But shall I then, simply because such things exist, go and become a criminal? We shan't be able to finish our discussion today, said Max in a milder tone. You must certainly not commit murder or rape, no, but you haven't yet reached that point where one can see what is permitted and what is really taboo. You have realized only a part of the truth. The remainder will come after. Rely on it. For instance, for the past year or so you have had in your you an instinct which is stronger than all of the others and which is held to be taboo. The Greeks and many other people, on the contrary, made a sort of divinity out of this instinct and honored it by great celebrations. What is now taboo is therefore not eternally so. It can change. Today, everyone is permitted to sleep with a woman as soon as he has been with her to a parson, as soon as he has been with her to a parson and has gone through the ceremony of marriage. With other races, it is different, even today. For that reason, each one of us must find out for himself what is permitted and what is forbidden. Forbidden, that is, to himself. You need never do anything that is forbidden and yet be a thorough rascal, and vice versa. It is really merely a question of convenience. Whoever is too lazy to think of himself and to constitute himself his own judge simply conforms to the taboos, whatever they happen to be. He has an easy time of it. Others realize they carry laws in themselves. For them, things are forbidden which every man of honor does daily. On the other hand, things are permitted them which are otherwise taboo. Everyone must stand up for himself. Suddenly, he seemed to regret having said so much and broke off. I felt I could understand to a certain extent what his sentiment was. That is to say, however agreeably he used to present his ideas, apparently in a customary manner, he could on no account tolerate a conversation made simply for the sake of talking, as he once said. He realized in my case that although my interest was genuine enough, I was too much inclined to look upon discussion as a game, too fond of clever talking. In short, I was lacking in perfect seriousness. As I read again the words I have just written, perfect seriousness, another scene suddenly comes into my mind. The most impressive experience I lived through with Max Demian in those still half chill childlike times. Our confirmation classes were drawing to an end, and the closing lessons were devoted to the Last Supper. The clergyman thought this very important, and he took pains to make us feel something of the inspiration and sacred character of his teaching. However, precisely in those last few lessons, thoughts were diverted to another object, to the person of my friend looking forward to my confirmation, which was explained to us as being our solemn admission into the community of church. The thought presented itself imperatively to me that the value of this half year's religious instructions did not lie for me in what I had learned in the class, but rather in Demian's presence and influence. It was not in the church that I was ready to be received, but into something else, into an order of ideas and of personalities which surely existed somewhere or other on earth, and of which I felt my friend was the representative or messenger. I tried to repress this thought, In spite of everything, I earnestly intended to go through the ceremony of confirmation with a certain dignity, and the new notions I was forming seemed scarcely compatible with this. Yet, do what I would, the idea was there and gradually identified itself with the approaching religious ceremony. I was ready to celebrate it in a different fashion from the other confirmation candidates. For me, it would mean admission into a world of ideas with which I had become acquainted through Demian. In those days, it happened that I had another discussion with him. It was just before a lesson. My friend was wrapped up in himself and took little pleasure in my talk, which was perhaps rather precocious and bombastic. We talk too much, he said, with unwanted gravity. Wise speeches have no value at all, absolutely none. You only escape from yourself. To escape from yourself is a sin. You should be able to creep right into yourself like a tortoise. We entered the schoolroom immediately after the lesson began. I took pains to listen, and Demian did not disturb me in my effort. After a while, I began to feel something peculiar at my side where his place was, a sort of emptiness or coolness or something like that, as if his seat had suddenly become vacant. The feeling became oppressive, and I turned round. There I saw my friend sitting, upright and in his customary attitude. But he looked quite different from usual. Something I did not know went out from him, enveloped him. I thought his eyes were closed until I saw he held them open, but they were stiff as if gazing within or directed to an object a great way off. He sat there perfectly motionless. He seemed not to be breathing, and his mouth was as if carved out of wood or stone. His face was white, uniformly white as stone. His brown hair showed more signs of life than did any other feature. His hands lay before him on the desk without life, as still as inanimate objects like stones or fruits, white and motionless, yet not relaxed, but as if controlling the secret springs of a powerful life force. The sight made me tremble. He is dead, I thought. I almost said it out loud, but I knew he was not dead. Mesmerized, I hung on his look. My eyes were riveted on this white stone mask. I felt it was the Demian who was in the habit of walking and talking with me. That was only one side of him, a half. Demian, who from time to time played a part, who accommodated himself to circumstances out of mere complacence. But the real Demian looked like this, with just this look of stone, prehistorically old, like an animal, beautiful and cold, dead yet secretly full of fabulous life force. And around him, this still emptiness, this infinite ethereal space, this lonely death. Now he has quite retired into himself, I felt with a shudder. Never had I been so isolated. I had no part in him. He was unattainable. He was further from me than if he had been on the most distant isle in the world. I scarcely understood why no one besides myself noticed it. I thought that everyone would have to remark him, that everyone would shudder, but no one gave him any attention. He sat like a picture, and as I could not prevent myself from thinking, as stiff as a strange idol. A fly settled on his forehead, moved slowly down over his nose and lips, not a muscle, not a nerve in his face twitched. Where was he now? What was he thinking? What was he feeling? Was he in heaven or in hell? It was impossible for me to question him when I saw him at the end of the lesson, living and breathing again, when his glance met mine. Was he as he formerly had been? Where did he come from? Where had he been? He seemed tired, his face had its normal color, his hands moved again, but his brown hair was lusterless and fatigued, as it were. In the days following, I practiced a new exercise in my bedroom several times. I sat stiffly on a chair, kept my eyes fixed, and held myself perfectly motionless. I waited to see how long I could maintain this attitude and what the sensation would be like. However, I merely got very tired and suffered from a violent twitching of the eyelids. The confirmations took place soon after, of which no important recollection remained with me. Everything was now quite changed. Childhood fell about me in ruins. My parents used to look at me with a certain embarrassment. My sisters had become quite strange in their conduct towards me. A disillusionment falsified and weakened the old sentiments and pleasures. The garden was without fragrance. The wood was no longer inviting. The worlds around me seemed like a clearance sale of old articles, insipid and without charm. Books were merely paper. music, and noise. The leaves fall thus from a tree in autumn. The tree feels it not. Rain drips on it. Sun comes in frost. And the life in it recedes slowly into the narrowest and most inward recess. The tree is not dying, it is waiting. It was decided that after the holidays I should go to another school, leaving home for the first time. My mother, meanwhile, approached me with special tenderness, a sort of preliminary goodbye, endeavoring to charm me with a love from which I should go with homesickness and unforgetfulness in my heart. Demian had gone away. I was alone. That brings us to the end of this chapter. Next, chapter 4, we will read in next recording. Bye bye for now. If you have any comments, you can reach out and type in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of the channel, of YouTube channel. If you have anything at all. Bye bye. Keep reading. Take care. And if you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share. Bye.